welcome to our second panel of the Housing, Communities and Local Government Select Committee, our session looking at property management. Can I ask our guests to introduce themselves, please, for Hansard?
Morning, my name's Dan Turnbull. I'm the Senior Director of Markets at the Competition and Markets Authority.
I'm Caris Thomas. I'm a ward member in a Leek ward in Rushcliffe Borough Council. I'm a councillor. Thank you.
Thank you.
Martin King. I am Managing Director of the Firstport Group.
Andrew Bulmer, Chief Exec of the Property Institute. Just to be clear, a professional body with 7,000 members, 360 firms that manage just over 1.5 million leasehold and build to rent and Scottish freehold properties. I'll leave it there. I think others will come up in conversation.
Thank you. I'm sure you've heard some of the comments and questions in the first session, so we're going to move into looking at local authority adoption and regulation of estate charges. Maya.
Dan, I'd like to start with you. The government suggested that the Leasehold and Freehold Reform Act addresses the majority of the principles outlined in your report. Do you agree with the government's assessment?
Thank you. So when we opened our house building market study, we invited people to comment, and the single issue that we received the most comments on, over 250, was on estate management charges. So we knew that this is something that's really important to people. It's also something that's clearly becoming more prevalent. So we checked in with the 11 largest house builders, and over the previous 5 years, 80% of their new projects had been put under this estate management model. So it's clearly becoming much more prevalent, and unless something is done to address that, will continue to grow into the future. Now, Ms. Ali in the previous session set out very clearly some of the issues that people face. But just to summarise what we found that homeowners may be poorly informed about important details relating to the arrangements and their long-term implications. The unadopted amenities may be constructed or maintained to a poor standard. Bills that people face can be large, unexpected, and increase into the future in a large proportion. We found up to 60% in some cases can go on management and admin fees. And it's very difficult for homeowners in many cases to monitor the quality of the work, what they're getting for their money, and in particular if they want to challenge that or to switch management company. In some cases we found it was virtually impossible for them to do so. So we set out 2 broad sets of recommendations to tackle this. The first was recommendations for actions government should take to reduce the prevalence of this type of arrangement, and the second was recommendations to protect people living under estate management arrangements. And what the Act does is to provide some protections in that second space. And our sense is that these provide a useful foundation for freeholders to be protected, but we think that there are some areas where the government could go further to provide protections. Just to pick out 2 of those key areas. One of those, because we were looking at new house building, one of those is the information that's provided by house builders to people at the point when they're looking to make the purchase. And Ms. Rudolph made the point very clearly about loss aversion, and we think that's important too. We think that house builders should be required at an early stage in the process to inform people about the nature of the charges, what they'll cover, what the first year of charges are likely to be really clear to people that those charges can be potentially uncapped and can increase in the future, to tell people what their potential rights of redress are under this, and to tell people what their ability or non-ability to switch away from that company would be. And then that brings me to my second point, which is allowing no-fault switching or making that easier. We think in many cases this is just too difficult for freeholders to effect. And, you know, in all markets that we look at, we would much rather that if competitive pressure can be brought to bear to discipline the market, that is often more effective and has less unintended consequences than regulation. Okay. So, but an absolute key part of that is that people are able to switch when they need to. And we saw that around 20% of those arrangements that we looked at were what are called embedded management companies, where it's stated on the deed that this management company will be the management company. And in some of those cases, it seemed, as far as we could see, impossible for anyone to make the switch. And some of those that we looked at even said that there's no right for homeowners to switch away, even if the management company doesn't fulfil the obligations that they're supposed to.
Very clear.
Joe.
Just one brief follow-up, Dan, if I can. Have you considered the issue in this market where you have a small number of very large managing agents, including Firstport, who are largely owned by overseas private equity? They have over 400,000 units, and then every other competitor is relatively tiny. Like, how is that, from your perspective, a fair market?
So our market study was into house building rather than into estate management, so we didn't consider those structural issues in that sector. But I think one of the key points that we would bring out, and particularly when we're looking at redress, is the imbalance of power that there can be. And I think we would find that where you have larger, more well-resourced companies, that imbalance of power is likely to be greater. So that's something that would concern us.
One very quick one. You talked about the 20% of embedded management companies. As far as I can see, there's there's a significant larger section where there is effectively a resident management company, but the directors on the board of those are from the developer, and that process never gets handed over. So it's still effectively impossible for that management company to be removed by the residents. I've got issues in my constituencies. Have you got evidence of how much of a problem that is, and any thoughts on how that might be solved? Because that is going to have to be regulated differently.
Yeah, so we don't have sort of quantitative evidence of the extent of that issue, but certainly we did find areas where resident management companies did have exactly the type of issue that you're talking about. So I certainly wouldn't say that those problems are restricted to embedded management companies.
Hi, are you okay?
Yeah, fine.
Thank you. Chris, on to you in terms of...
I'll just come to you, Karis. I mean, the best way of solving this problem is to minimise the extent to which it becomes one in the first place. Not specifically on leasehold, but particularly on the kind of leasehold, freehold problem. Why do you think it is? We seem to have an increasing number of bits and pieces on these new build estates that aren't being adopted by local councils. Why do you think that is?
I think there are several reasons. It started around about 2011 in our council, when the council came to a policy decision that it was no longer going to adopt. Previously to that, they were adopting with a commuted sum. They'd come to the conclusion that the commuted sums were not enough. And there were other pressures on the budget because government funding for the councils was coming down. And so they stopped adopting. I should explain that the views that I'm putting forward are the views of myself and my fellow ward members. Councillor Way's in the back there. She wrote our response to the CMA consultation. And so they're our views, really, not the council's views. Since we became councillors, our caseload has been dominated by this issue. People in real misery, anger and frustration at the situation that they found them in. They bought their houses, they found out about these management charges, and their dreams have been turned to ashes, basically. And there's one. We'll be dealing with a new case every week, and that's been dominating our case. But we've been trying to get the council to change the policy. The other reasons that you would imagine, wouldn't you, that if estates can be maintained in the past from council tax, then new estates, they're getting more council tax, and so they should still be able to maintain them. So, but the things that have changed on the estates is there are more of these public utilities on the estates being provided. So it's not just the odd little bit of grass in the middle, it's country parks, it's car parks, sustainable drainage units, it's footpaths, whole areas of large resources, play parks, large play parks, all these things. They weren't in previous designs of estates. But they're they're being provided by the developers within the estates rather than by the councils in the community. So that's another issue. But some of the charges could be designed out in estate design if that was wanted. So those are a couple of the reasons, I think.
So, I mean, do you think there should be better guidance from government, or do you think councils should be better at adopting more or working out an increasing amount that they can adopt?
Councils should be adopting. It should be mandatory for councils to adopt. The other reasons that our council says they don't adopt or don't even consider it is that the developers don't want them to be adopted. But making it mandatory would stop that on both sides. And no one council, Rushcliffe is a very rich council. If any council could afford to adopt public estates, it's Rushcliffe. But they're not going to do it if they're the only ones that are doing it. It has to be legislated that adoption is mandatory. These are not. I mean, the leasehold situation is desperate, I know, and it needs to be resolved. But these are not leaseholders; they're freeholders. They've bought their houses. They've bought the land that their houses are on. They're not paying for communal facilities for a small group of people in a block of flats or in a small group of houses or a gated estate. They're paying for public amenities. We've got a footpath, for instance, that is the prime access to a school, and that is paid for by one estate. The sustainable drainage ponds are paid for by residents on an estate, but they're not the ones that benefit from them. It's the people downstream of them that benefit from them. If they fail, it's not going to be the people on that estate that are affected. It's the people downstream of them. So, sorry, I've said too much.
So, I mean, a lot of this, I think it seems like there's two problems, one of which is local government finance, which is causing problems here. The lack of money in local councils means that they'd quite often be comfortable not taking these on because they can't afford it. But the other one is the planning process, because ultimately I assume you could use the planning process to remove many of these barriers, ensuring that there aren't things put in that the council couldn't afford to adopt or whatever it would happen to be. Do you think there's more that could be done in the planning process to inevitably protect consumers from some of these charges?
I think there is more that could be done in the planning process, but on the whole there's not much that that councils can do until it's changed, really. There has to be legislation to make it mandatory. The things that councils could do is they could ensure that Section 106 agreements don't include these embedded management companies where the land is given to the management company. Because our estates were adopted very early on in this situation, we've got lots of estates in that situation. And they could at least be the residents' management company model, which is easier to adopt retrospectively. I think all existing estates should be adopted retrospectively, and if government and councils wanted that to happen, you could make it happen. It just has to want to happen. I think the other thing that councils can do is design out management charges, as I've already said. They could require the building of all amenities to be to an adoptable standard. One of the problems is that they're built to cheaper standards, so they can never be adopted by highways. Highways won't adopt them because they're not built to their standards. So in order to adopt them in the future, for whatever reason, they would have to be built up to those standards. But if they were built to adoptable standards to start off with, there wouldn't be that problem. And then, even if the councils are not prepared to adopt the whole thing, they ought to be adopting parts of it. The play parks or whatever, they ought to have ways. They ought to have ways to encourage and support parish councils and town councils to adopt the allotments, to adopt the smaller areas of play and so on. The other thing that really needs to happen is that the SUDs need to be adopted. And there's a part of the Water Act that hasn't been enacted, and I've been asking questions about this. The last government said they would enact it, that would set up SUDS boards and make sure that the SUDS were adopted. If the SUDS were taken out of the equation, it would be a lot easier for local authorities to adopt. The drainage ponds are technical, the equipment's underground, you need technical expertise to assess them and to make sure they're working properly. And the councils don't have that level of expertise. the equipment's underground. If it fails, it'll be enormously expensive to rectify, and the residents will get a one-off bill for it. And it's not them that benefit from the SUDs, it's the rest of the community. So that is one that has to be dealt with. I think another thing is fly tipping and encampment. These are two things that are really concern residents. If they have an encampment or a fly tipping episode, they are going to have to fit the bill, tens of thousands of pounds. So all those things could be looked at, but actually what you need to do is make sure that they're all adopted, and that's it. Just implement what the CMA have said on adoption.
I think key issues in terms of transparency of what those fees are actually being charged. We're going to move on to estate charges now. Start with you, Chris, and then I'll come to Lewis.
Do you want to start with Lewis? Sorry,
Yeah.
I assumed Lewis was going first.
I've just got a few questions for you, Martin, if I can. So you became Managing Director of Firstport in 2024. So what changes have you implemented at the company since you've been in post?
So thank you, if I may first, Chair, thank you and committee for the opportunity of speaking here today. So it's been a busy 12 to 14 months. I joined last January, and I'd been away from the industry for a while, for a couple of years, and certainly coming back and taking over the reins of Firstport, there were obviously a number of areas that we as Firstport need to get better at. As an industry, it obviously become very complex in the years that I'd been away, and there are a number of changes that we had to put in place that made us fit for purpose in regards to the regulation that's coming down the train that we've discussed today. If I may, first of all, I'm absolutely pro the regulation that is coming down for our industry. We were not involved, but we're certainly fully aware of Lord Best's work, which is excellent, in 2018, and we supported it then, and I do now. I think regulation is key. We've had a number of...
Sorry, can I interrupt you there? I don't want waffle. I just want to know what you've implemented since you've been in charge of the company to make Firstport better, please.
To make Firstport better, in order to meet the regulation that's coming, one of the first things I did was regionalise the business. So we're now into 4 separate regions with operations directors that run each of those regions. We've completely reviewed our communication and complaints process that is now in place. We are looking at, as mentioned a number of times today, qualifications and training is absolutely vital. I couldn't agree more that we have to, in this complex environment, and much of the discussion today is about how complex it is, we have to have the right people with the right qualifications doing it. And so for that, we've been working with TPI. What I've asked for is our entire company goes through at least TPI level 2 and then beyond, depending on the complexity that they work on. And I'm pleased that at the moment we've got over 1,000 individuals that have gone through that, and more are being pushed into levels 3, 4 and beyond. So many of the changes we and I have put in place are about ensuring the professionalisation of the business. That's the direction of travel for us as an industry, and I completely agree with that. We are the largest, and I know that's been mentioned a number of times, but we still only represent 5.8% of this entire industry. So there are many other property management agents out there, and we are able, due to our size and capability, to put in place many of the training needs, the qualification requirements, communication with our customers, transparency. We've also included My Home, which is a new online portal. Much of what we're talking about today is about communication, understanding. Residents who are in their homes need to understand what they're paying for and getting that transparency. So My Home I launched last year. It's not even a year old as yet, but we have about 50-60% of our customers are now on My Home. We have 10,000 unique visits every single day where documentation can be downloaded. People can actually look at their development. We can communicate with them directly. And that, of course, all helps much of what the conversation has been driven around today, understanding, transparency and communication with residents.
Just on communication, are you happy with where it is now in the company then with residents?
So it's a lot better than it was. We are communicating with our residents.
Are you measuring the fact that you're saying it's a lot better, Martin?
Yeah.
So
we are. We've got a number of KPIs, as you'd expect, throughout the business. And those KPIs are from our pick-up rates from the phone, our first-time resolution. I'm pleased that complaints into the business in the last 12 months has reduced by 48%. We've onshored our call centre, so we can then have a dedicated group in the UK that are trained sufficiently to answer that call and then resolve often what are complex questions. So we measure as much as we possibly can. I track them, I don't say daily, but pretty much daily. I want to see those results coming through, and I want to know that our complaint rate, which stands at the moment today 1.3 in every 1,000 customers that we have, which is about half the actual industry average. So
are your
that
complaints
doesn't
reducing, Martin, to 48%? Good figure. Would you say that's because probably your residents have stopped complaining and they're complaining to us as parliamentarians?
So I think the MP work that obviously I've been to Parliament a number of times in the last 6 to 7 months, and quite honestly that's helped the process for Firstport. As Managing Director of Firstport, as you, Mr. Coggan mentioned, I came in 12 months ago, and actually meeting the MPs, hearing the feedback that we've had from each of the different regions that those MPs represent has been extremely useful, and we have completely lent into that. I've met over 170 MPs in Parliament in the last 8 months, and on the ground, talking to residents with the MP on a one-to-one basis, over 70 of those meetings. So we're not shying away from communicating with our residents. I'm certainly not shying away from the challenges that the industry has and Firstport is part of. And I certainly want to ensure that what we put in place and what I am designing through Firstport improves the whole of this industry, as well as obviously Firstport's performance.
We've got quite a number of members indicating, so I'll start with Nashaba, Joe, and Chris, and then Andrew.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Martin, for that. And it's just really helpful to understand some of the things that you've put into place. How confident are you? I mean, I appreciate you've given some of those figures around your complaint system, but how confident are you that when residents have queries that they're getting the responses that they require, but also that their queries, particularly around things like service charges and fees, are being dealt with appropriately? I mean, there is evidence in my constituency that I'm aware of where people in the last 12 months have still had issues where they've contacted systems and they've contacted to ask for queries around service charge and then been ignored or then issued with warnings and then started to receive notices and then gone down a spiral of getting debt collectors all the time while trying to resolve that directly with Firstport. So while the figures are really helpful to understand, as Managing Director, how confident are you in what the story that's actually telling?
So I'm confident that I still have an awful lot to do. Firstport is in no way, at the moment, absolutely leading the industry, but we are certainly on that journey. So the figures I gave earlier are good indicators that we are putting the plans in place, and I am putting those plans in place. Transparency and communication with residents is absolutely vital. What service charge, and again discussed today a number of times, service charges are complex, people don't understand them. When are they informed about them, and do they know what they're actually getting? All of that.
I just come back on that though. I appreciate what you say, but I do think it's slightly disingenuous to suggest that people don't understand service charges if they're not provided clear breakdowns in the first place, or set out clearly what they're paying for. Most people are able to make sense of a service charge, but I think that's slightly disingenuous.
So I think clarity, openness and transparency in what those service charges are is absolutely vital. I think the whole education process of this as an industry is key. And I have those conversations, I know a number of MPs do, though, where residents who are in their home don't understand what they're paying for. We've had that discussion today. What I'm determined to do is understand what areas I need to improve in, what Firstport needs to get better at, and then be transparent on those points.
Chris.
I mean, I suppose most people on this panel will have Firstport properties in their constituency, and what you're describing is like quite some distance from the experience of us and our residents. The thing about Red House Park in my constituency, as of May this year, you emailed telling me that you hadn't signed off the accounts from 2022. That's before we get onto 2023 and then 2024. You talk about your complaints portal. I've got notes from my residents in Red House Park being said that complaints that they put into the portal just get taken down without any redress. I've got examples of people being sent legal letters, the things that they're disputing. It seems like you just send the legal letters out in hope that people dispute them, and then the moment we point out that what is being put forward, and this is all happening under your watch currently, then the moment we start to dispute that, eventually the lawyers back down. It seems like there's a just put the legal letter in and hope that nobody queries it. We've got 123% increase in costs for work to maintain gates that haven't worked for 8 years. And these are far from the worst stories that I'm sure you've heard from the 170 MPs you've met, which, you know, I think the fact that 170 MPs have a problem is in itself evidence of how much of an issue this is. So, well, let's start with this. Do you survey your residents, and do you know what level of, pardon the complaint numbers, do you know what level of satisfaction you have among your residents for the service that you provide?
So yes, we do, and that's been kicked off recently in regards to obviously we see our residents through the property managers who are on the ground, and have ensured that those property managers are visiting site much more often than they used to. So they're a lot more visible. They can answer questions along with the qualifications that they are pursuing. I'm aware that we don't get it right all the time, and you know, in the last 12 to 14 months,
the time would be nice.
So,
right, any of the time.
So our complaints, as I mentioned earlier, we obviously monitor how many complaints we get coming into the business. So we know what those are. We're getting much better at answering them and first-time resolution. There are obviously specific issues throughout the country that we are leaning into. We are meeting those residents, and we have town halls on a very regular basis where that can be set up, whether it's an MP involved or not, and the operations directors and the property managers who are there will sit and talk through. I have met a lot of MPs. I know there's a great deal of obviously interest in this entire topic, and in many cases we've gone out, we've explained a number of the issues, some of which are us and some of which are not. And as we have discussed today, it is a complex environment with a number of different players in this market, and we as the managing agent are responsible for some things but not everything.
If any other business was responsible for managing a gate, didn't fix it for 8 years, and then turned around to residents and said, we want 123% increase in your fees to manage gates that haven't worked for 8 years, that company would be out of business within months. And yet, because of the way this entire sector is set up, because there's no real competition, because it's so hard to get rid of you when you're not performing your duties, that gate hasn't been fixed for 8 years, and you still seem to be making millions of pounds in dividends for your shareholders. It seems like you're milking the system, doesn't it?
So obviously the industry is under review, and there is regulatory reform being written, and we have obviously read the white paper and we're waiting for what comes out further down the line. We absolutely embrace those professional changes that are required. I want Firstport to be better, and I want it to lead. There are obviously individual cases where things, for whatever reason, I can look into that if you provide that to me separately. I'll look into that particular case and see what the issues are. But as a company and as an industry, we absolutely embrace the professional changes that you are going through and wanting us to adopt. It is a complex environment, which I think everyone here acknowledges. And as the property managing agent in the middle of that, we have to work with all aspects of the industry. As clear as that can be, or as professional as we can be, as qualified, then the scenarios that you describe, ideally I want to drive out.
Martin, one of the things that residents are concerned about is they think that Firstport gets at the pie from multiple angles. So, for example, your in-house insurance company, can you provide us assurances that Knight Square Insurance that you control is providing good value for money?
So first of all, it is not an in-house. It doesn't belong to Firstport. It is completely separate from us, deliberately for the obvious reasons that we're talking about it. It is a separate entity. It's FCA regulated. I have no running entity within it at all. I'm managing director of Firstport, and that's what I am involved in solely. It is completely separate from the Firstport entity.
How much do you use this company that's part of your bigger corporate structure?
About a third of our portfolio is through KSI Insurance.
How can you ensure us that which is part of your corporate family is delivering good value for money?
So like all insurance brokers, so it is a broker, it doesn't provide insurance as a provider, it brokes for other people within the industry as well. So it will go out, it will run through FCA as part of the FCA regulation, it will go into the market, it will look at least 3 different quotes for whatever is in the leasehold or the transfer deed, what is required on that particular development, and then we'll come back and offer the best option for it. In many cases it doesn't have to be taken up for that, other people can broker that same insurance as well.
Do we know what percentage of the sector overall uses KSI? You say it's a third of yours. Is it a third overall?
So the focus for me, obviously, is the Firstport portfolio.
Yeah.
I don't get involved with understanding what the insurance market is for them. So no, I couldn't answer that. I could probably go away and find out separately.
Would you accept the premise that if it was an open market and everyone was going for the best deal, it should be the same percentage of Firstport that's using it as the industry as a whole, and if it was higher, that would imply some sort of bias towards Firstport using a broker that's within the parent umbrella compared to the industry as a whole?
So again, for me as managing director of Firstport,
would you accept that was true? That would be indication of a problem.
So I think part of this is the reason why it is separate from our entity. Their market share, how they conduct themselves as part of an FCA regulated industry is their business. I deliberately, of course, want to be separate from that for the reasons we're talking about this. It needs to be separate and it needs to be done professionally. Their market share, I do not know. What I do know is about a third of our portfolio is administered through that KSI.
Okay. Andrew, and then Will.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Martin, for being here. Look, I still feel new to this job, right? And as an MP, you have to be across local issues, national issues, and international issues as best as you possibly can. You can't be across everything. But some issues cut through, and Firstport has cut through. And I'm afraid, I think it will be universally acknowledged amongst this committee that the reputation of Firstport is not in a good place. And there's an old saying, which is, reputation is reality with a lag effect. But look, I want to recognise that you're here, you're fronting up and answering these questions. But there's a simple one, I think, which is, are you willing, on the record today, to apologise to Firstport, everyone who's had an association with Firstport the last couple of years, for what's happened?
So certainly as Managing Director of Firstport, we have not got things right all the time. And I'm addressing that both physically by changing the company, implementing the different changes that we have put in place. And we never want, I certainly going forward with the training, with the expertise, with the onshoring, with the professionalisation of both Firstport and the industry, I want to reduce to as little as I possibly can any distress that we have put in place for anyone that is a resident of a property that we have. Of course, if things have gone wrong in the past and will go wrong in the future, things, it's never going to be 100%, then I don't want that, and that is not a good place to be in.
Sorry, Martin, to cut across. That's a qualified answer, and we've all watched these kind of sessions before. I'm just going to give you one more opportunity to just say that you're sorry for where we've got to recognise and then to have the conversation. I need to hand it over to a colleague, but this is an important moment. People are watching. This is on the record. Do you want to apologise?
So, of course, for me, I do not want to cause any distress. I regret any distress that anyone has had in there if they have encountered a poor performance from Firstport, and I want to change that going forward. So, of course, we as Firstport, I as Managing Director, regret any distress that anyone has had in working with us. The important point, I think, also is how we then redress that, how we move forward, how we put in place a professional Firstport, which we are on that track on, certainly, as we've discussed now, with a regulatory reform profile that is coming down the track, that as
do you feel that you should make those changes even if the regulatory reform takes time to come
absolutely. Yeah, so it's not out yet. We've read the white paper. We obviously are fully aware of Lord Best's endeavours over the number of years, which are excellent, all of which I agree with. So what we're not doing is waiting for anything to come. We're not waiting for the final version. I recognise, referencing the questions that we've had today, that we, both as an industry but as Firstport, need to be a lot better. And that is through qualifications, through a complex set of requirements for a property manager, which is getting all more complex. They need to be ready for the future.
One last sentence, because you regret distress caused, but you've not said sorry. And look, from my experience and professional experience before being elected, if you're a company in the private sector and things have gone wrong, you are more likely to be heard in the future if you are brave enough to just say, I am sorry.
So absolutely, I'm sorry if I wasn't clear. So I both regret and it is unfortunate, and I am sorry for any distress in the past for whatever reason that people haven't understood.
It is unfortunate. It is unfortunate.
It is unfortunate, of course, because...
I'll bring in other colleagues.
Yeah.
Thank you. Will, very quickly, and then I want to bring in Andrew.
Martin, sort of thank you for sort of eventually sort of saying that apology. I think that's helpful. I wish it was a bit more forthcoming, but I want to dive into some detail. We heard earlier today of people being charged £24,000 for cutting grass on half a football pitch.
Yeah.
We've had examples of people being charged £150 to change a light bulb, where we don't think the light bulb's been replaced. Do you think Firstport's charges are reasonable? I don't, in my experience as MP for Woking and hearing other stories. How do you think you're going to get your charges down to them be reasonable and fit within the law?
So charges, obviously both service charge and state charges have been discussed a number of times today, and the understanding of what constitutes that. So I am reviewing all of our charges at the moment. They need to be proportionate, they need to be accurate, and people need to understand them. Obviously we provide a service to customers who live in homes, and they need to know what they're paying for from the earliest stage, whether they're moving into a property or whether they've lived there for a number of years. So for us, when we get the right level of service and the right contractor, as I mentioned earlier, we have regionalised the business. That should help us understand a more regional aspect of the type of contractor we bring in. They obviously have to be qualified and have the right levels of experience to perform whatever work that they are doing. But certainly, what I don't like is obviously quotes of outrageous figures. And again, please send those details to me and I'll look into them. What we have to do is get better at explaining what those charges are for and what people get for their money through their whichever managing agent that is.
Thank you. We've also heard earlier today that actually a 5-year investment plan is really important for potential new tenants, but for others as well, so they can plan and you can smooth out the costs. Yeah. At what point will all of your properties have a 5-year investment plan and it be published?
So I think as part of the reforms, if that is then going to be part of that, then we would welcome a longer term plan to put forward, and then residents can understand, as you mentioned, what they are looking to pay for, what potentially is coming down of any sort of large payments for major works, etc. So for Firstport, what I don't want are shocks to our residents. I want them to be able to plan. I'm a resident, I'm a normal person that has to plan financially ahead like everyone else here, and I want to make sure that individuals who live in properties that we manage can actually plan ahead and understand what's coming if there's the roof or the lift needs changing.
You said only if the legislation comes in. You're not going to do a 5-year plan that people can understand unless you're made to.
No, so we are looking at how we explain all of our charges and how we explain the plan going forward for as best that we can. Obviously, as we do cost estimates at the end of each year, we try and anticipate what's coming and what costs there will be for that development for whatever reason, whether it's a major work or whether it's the cost of looking after anything that was mentioned earlier on an estate. So as much as I possibly can, I want to look ahead and I want to plan for a longer period of time rather than just a 12-month period. Often our contract will be 12 months, so we tend to do it 12 months. But if we can look further ahead, then that would be a sensible thing to do. I'm just mindful of time. We could spend a lot more longer on this issue. And I think you've heard the strength from the committee. I think it's fair to say that you've met with 170 MPs today. It will be more because of competing demands. Many MPs, including myself, were not able to make some of those meetings. We appreciate the engagement you are carrying out with MPs from across the country, but I think it is fair to say that this is a big issue and concern to the fact that obviously Firstport were actually suspended from the Property Institute's managing platform earlier this year. I just want to know going forward, Martin, how you're going to keep this committee updated and the progress. Will you commit to writing to us in about maybe 3 months, just an update progress on what Firstport have been doing? So we are already communicating with a number of MPs. We've already made those commitments to ensure. The select committee, not the MPs. Then of course, we will write to you however that occurs, and we'll make sure that we update you on the progress that we're making. Thank you. Just wanted to bring in Andrew before our time's up, just to get your thoughts on some of the regulation and reform coming forward. And again, you've heard a lot about the scope for regulation. In your view, do you think that would address some of the concerns that we've all been hearing this morning?
There's no question about it, and with time against us, I'd go back to Lord Best's excellent response earlier to the committee, which I fully endorse. You would expect me to say that because I was on his working group. I liken the situation to the apocryphal tale of the ambulance down in the valley. People fall off a cliff. Should we put a fence at the top of a cliff or an ambulance down in the valley? Redress and tribunals are fixing a problem after harm has occurred.
Yes.
It is better to avoid harm in the first place. It is better to have a fence at the top of the cliff. A regulator will be able to address systemic failure, build that into the code, and then enforce. So a regulator carries out quite a different function to address, and we are anxious. The industry is anxious to see this being brought forward.
In terms of the industry, you mentioned the portfolio. You have such a large portfolio of members registered to the property industry. What steps are the industry taking collectively in terms of looking at pre-legislation scrutiny and probably informing government ministers to make sure that legislation and regulation is watertight, essentially? Have you been involved in any discussions?
We have met with civil servants and, where we can, ministers, where we are granted an audience to put forward that position, to make and frame the arguments for regulation. In the interim, our job, we are not a regulator, we have limited powers. Our job is to lead the industry and to lift the industry, and for that reason we continue to evolve our off-qual qualifications and the way in which we can look at and audit firms. We can see that the industry is responding. In 2016 we had 3,000 members, we're now at 7,000 members. So we can see that there's an uptick in engagement with the industry, which is encouraging. But the industry has become a lot more complex. Rightly, consumer expectations have risen. The building safety environment has now become intensely complicated. And the demands on property managers are far more than they used to be a few years ago. So responsible industry has stepped forward. Training is taking place, qualifications are taking place. And we will continue to do what we can to lift the industry on a rising tide.
Apart from suspension from the trade body, what other sanctions are available to essentially managing agents that cause you concern and organisations?
Our sanctions are very limited in that it is it's an apology, it is suspension, or it is expulsion. But what we cannot do is to stop any firm from trading. We can't pull anybody's licence, be it an individual or be it a firm. So our members come to us because on a voluntary basis they pay to be a member. Our fees are modest, but nonetheless they add up. And those members then take advantage of the resources that we have to hopefully do better.
Any final comments before we wrap up, just from other panel members on this vital issue? I want to thank everyone for coming this morning. I think it's fair to say this is an area that we will continue to scrutinise and look at, especially as we get closer to that long-awaited leasehold and common hold legislation from the government. Thank you to the panel members, witnesses for coming this morning. Thank you to committee members. Order, order.